Hello, in this video I'm showing you how to replace a pump in a Vaillant ecoTec Pro or Plus boiler. Also how to check if your pump is actually faulty. All this with detailed step-by-step instructions. Now Vaillant's instructions says that you need to remove the diverter valve so you can get the pump out. Well, I've never removed the diverter valve to get the pump out. I don't see the need to do it. It's just additional work that's not needed. So in this video I'm showing you how I go about replacing that pump and leaving the diverter valve in position. Now if you do have a faulty pump, it's most likely that you got F75 come up in your display. I want to let you know that F75 fault can come up for lots of different reasons, not just a faulty pump. So before you go buying a really expensive pump, make sure that you've checked out the other causes that you may be getting the F75 fault for. And of course, I've made lots of other videos all about the F75 faults. One of those you'll find in the cards above now, and all the others you can find down in the description. Now, just before I get on with it, if you are unlucky enough to have a faulty pump and you need to replace it, I want to let you know that with the older boilers, they had a slightly different pump to the newer boilers, and Vaillant have now replaced that older pump with the newer pump, and you'll need to buy the pump plus an adapter lead to fit onto your boiler. Now this new pump and its lead comes in at around a rather eye-watering £260. But I want to let you know that recently I used an alternative, which was a BritTherm pump head, and that fitted in the boiler a treat, and it's about a third of the cost of that Vaillant pump, and it does exactly the same job. If you want to know more about this alternative pump head, then make sure you stick around to the end of the video and I'll show you exactly how I went about fitting this pump head. One last important point: to get to the pump I need to remove the cover of the boiler. When I remove the cover, that will affect combustion of the gas in the main heat exchanger. Because of this, only gas registered engineers should be removing the covers of Vaillant boilers. In the description below, I've left links to the gas register where you can find a gas registered engineer in the UK. Right, now let's get on with the video. So here's my Vaillant boiler, and we can see that it has F75 on the display. If I press the reset button, it's not very long before the boiler trips out again with the F75 fault. And that's because the pressure sensor inside the boiler is not seeing an increase in pressure because the pump is not running, which would increase the pressure. One of the ways to tell if your pump is running is when you turn your boiler on or you press the reset button, the boiler will operate the motorized valve, which is what you can hear now. And then we'll hear a click on the relay from the circuit board as it tries to run the pump. And if you don't hear a humming sound after the click from the relay, that's a good indication that your pump is not running. The boiler will try several times to run the pump, and when it doesn't see a pressure rise on the pressure sensor, it would then trip out with the F75 fault. And there we go, it's now tripped out with F75. Now you can do this check with the boiler cover on. After the click on the relay, if you hear the pump humming, but you don't see a pressure rise on the display, then you most likely got a faulty pressure sensor and not a faulty pump. Now the only real way to check if a pump is running is to actually physically check it. And to do that, we undo this large screw on the back of the pump head here, put a screwdriver inside, and if the pump is running well, you'll hear a sound like this. And you shouldn't be able to stop the pump from spinning. I'm always really careful when I do this because I might get lots of water pouring out, which may be scalding hot. Now if the pump isn't running, I can put my screwdriver into that hole there, I put it on the shaft of the pump, and I can rotate the shaft with my screwdriver. Obviously I need to do this when the boiler is trying to run, because the pump will only be spinning when the boiler is in operation. Now I could always check to make sure that there is power going to the pump by removing the electrical cover on the top of the pump and checking with a multimeter, and that would prove that the pump has actually got power. If the pump's got electrical power and the shaft's not spinning, then the pump is definitely faulty. Now there's one other thing that I would check before I go replacing the pump, and that's the capacitor in the pump. If that's faulty, then the pump will not run. A new capacitor is only around £10. So replacing the capacitor is way cheaper and a lot easier than replacing the whole pump. And of course I made a separate video all about how to check if a capacitor is faulty in a pump. Now the first thing I would do is to turn off the boiler, but because I need to get to the circuit board inside the boiler to disconnect the pump, I'll always turn off the power from outside the boiler. which should ensure there's no chance of getting any electric shocks or even damage the boiler. I then removed the front panel by undoing the big screw in the middle and pushing up on 2 clips and lifting the front cover off. Now I've removed my cover, I can fold down the front door and we can now see the pump, which is this big thing over here. Here's my new pump. Now these pumps are getting pretty hard to get hold of because Vaillant has upgraded them now, and the new pump of course is much more expensive. Now I'm just isolating the boiler from the rest of the central heating system. To do that I use a 4mm Allen key bit. I just put it into the Allen key slot and then turn it a quarter of a turn to close the flow valve, and then I do the same on the return valve. So both valves are now isolated, so the central heating system is isolated from the boiler. And I do this because I don't want to drain the rest of the system. The valves are shut when the screwdriver slot goes across the valve, and they're open when they're in line with the valve. I'm now opening up the drain valve on the central heating return valve, and I've got my vacuum and I'm sucking up the water which is coming out of that valve. So I'm draining all the pressure out of the boiler. This won't be all the water, there's always going to be water which is trapped inside the boiler. Now I'm just checking my pressure gauge there to make sure it is down to 0, and there you can see there's the last few drips just coming out of the boiler now. Here's a little tip for you: if you push a rubber tube onto the drain valve, then the water comes out in a nice steady stream and it doesn't spray everywhere. It makes the process a whole lot easier. I'm now going to close that drain valve because I don't want any more water running out of there suddenly when I'm not expecting it. Now before I get anything wet, I'm going to disconnect the pump from the circuit board. So I'm just going to remove the clip here and the clip on the other side. Then I can open up the panel and get access to the circuit board. I just follow the lead back from the pump and you can see the lead goes into there. It's clipped in on the side of the panel and it's just plugged in on the top. So I can just remove the plug like that. And there we are. That's that disconnected now. I can now remove the wire and close the panel back up again because I don't want any water getting onto that circuit board. The next thing I'm going to do is just to pull out this retainer clip here like that. I'm going to need to disconnect the pressure relief valve, that's the red thing, undo this nut here on the return pipe, remove the pressure gauge and remove the pipe from the pressure vessel. So I'm going to undo this nut here on the expansion pipe which is connected onto the pressure vessel. And there we go, and I'm also going to remove this old fibre washer. I'm then going to use a pair of grips to undo the nut which is on that return pipe. Now this nut shouldn't be very tight because it's done up onto a plastic fitting, and also when I refit it I need to be really careful that I don't over tighten it because again it's going onto a plastic fitting. And there we go, that's now undone and removed. Now I've got my water vacuum because as soon as I remove this pipe I'm going to get lots of water come running out. So I gently pull that pipe off and there we go, you can see all that water come gushing out of the boiler. I'm just going to use my vacuum, like I said, just catch all that water. It's just the water which is up inside the heat exchanger and any other pipework within the boiler. I'm now going to remove the pressure relief valve, and there's a little retaining clip again, so I just use my long nose pliers, pull that clip up to release the valve. And there we go, there's the clip. And now give the valve a wiggle and pull it forward to release it from the pump body. As soon as it releases from the pump body, I'm going to get more water come rushing out to the lower part of the boiler. But I just suck that up again with my water vacuum. I need to remove the nut on the bottom, and I use a long nose pair of pliers to grip that little awkward nut up there and give it a turn. They're usually not very tight because they're quite awkward to get to, and they do up onto a rubber washer. And there we go, that's now removed. I can now give it a wiggle and lift it out of the way. And there we go, that's the pressure relief valve. Now because I'm not going to remove the diverter valve, I need to undo 2 additional screws on the bottom of the boiler. One of them's quite easy to get to, the other one is a little bit tricky because it's on a slight angle because it's hidden by one of the pipes. So that's one of the screws there. You can now see I've removed both of those screws, and they hold the bracket which hold the pump housing. I'll now push the pump sideways to the right, giving it a little bit of a wiggle to release it from the diverter valve. At the same time I want to make sure I lift this pipe up and out of the way so the pump can move to the right hand side. And there we go, the pump is now free and moved away. So to easily get the pump out, I just need to remove the pressure gauge. So I'm going to remove that clip on the bottom there. So I just get my long nose pliers and just pull that clip out, and there we go. I now pull the pressure gauge upwards, giving it a wiggle to release it from the pump body. And there we go, that's that done. I can now just lift the whole pump assembly out of the boiler. And there we go. And I've done that without having to touch the diverter valve at all. So inside my new pump box, I have the pump. There's also some very basic instructions. We have all the new seals and O-rings, and there's also a new bracket and some screws. Just put that old pump to one side now. Here's all the new O-rings and the new bracket. I'm not going to need all of them because I've not removed the diverter valve. All the O-rings at the top of the screen are for the diverter valve, if I've gone down the route of removing the diverter valve as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is to fit the new bracket onto the new pump. So the bracket just goes over that lug on the back, and then we get the long screw, and then I just secure the bracket onto the pump by doing up that screw. Now I'm not going to do this screw up really tight because I'm going to leave the bracket just a little loose so I can line the screws up nice and easily once the pump is in position. Just before I show you fitting the new pump, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Mark Ballard and I've been a gas registered engineer for nearly 30 years. The aim of my channel is to help you with your central heating and your plumbing. If you find this video at all useful, then please give me that little bit of feedback by clicking on that thumbs up or the subscribe. You can ring on the bell if you want to receive a notification, and of course you can share the video with your friends. If you visit my website, I have categorized all my videos on products and parts that I recommend so you can easily find what you're looking for. And I'd like to say a really big thank you to everybody who's bought me a cup of coffee and left me a donation in my Toolbox fund. It's really appreciated, and it does really help me to make more videos which will hopefully help you. So I'm now going to use some silicone grease and just grease up the O-rings which I'm going to be using. So there's a thin O-ring which goes onto the return pipe. We got the fatter one which goes onto the diverter valve. And there's a little O-ring which goes onto the pressure gauge. And the small fibre washer which goes onto the expansion pipe, I do not grease up at all. I nearly forgot there's the O-ring which goes onto the pressure relief valve. So there we are, we've got 4 O-rings to go back onto the pump. I'm then going to put some silicone grease onto all the connections on the pump housing to make sure everything slips together nice and easily. And I get a good seal and there's no leaks. So now I'm going to get the pressure relief valve and remove the old O-ring from that. There we go, that's that old O-ring, put that in my bin box. I'm then just going to give it a clean before I apply some silicone grease. And there we go, I just put some grease onto that pressure relief valve, and then I can put the new O-ring onto that. And there we go, slip that onto there, then that's ready to go. I'm now just going to give it a quick test, make sure it slips in nice and easily into the pump housing, which it does, and there we go. I'm then going to do the same to the pressure gauge connection. I'm going to remove the old seal like that. I'm then going to give it a bit of a clean again. Make sure there's no bits of dirt on there like that. Put some more silicone grease on and fit the new O-ring. Then once again I can test it, make sure it fits okay. Now this fitting I find is always quite tight. But there we go, it fits okay. I've then removed the old O-ring from the diverter valve, and I'll also remove the old O-ring from the return pipe. Give both connections a bit of a clean to make sure there's no bits of dirt on there. Then once again get some silicone grease and wipe it around both the fittings. That's the diverter valve done. And there's the new O-ring fitted on the diverter valve. And again I put some more silicone grease and fit the O-ring onto the return pipe. And there we go. I now take the new pump assembly and put it in position in the boiler, locating it onto the diverter valve. I need to use 2 hands to do this because it's quite hard to push the pump across and onto that O-ring. But that's it, it's now on the O-ring. I'm now going to take the retaining clip, slide it into place so it locks the pump in its correct position. And there we go, that's now in the correct position. And the pump is nice and solid. I can now fit the return pipe and do up that nut. I'm always very careful with this nut because it's going onto a plastic screw thread. So that's that done. I'm now going to go underneath the boiler and fit those 2 screws back into the pump bracket. That's one done, and now fit the second one. I'm going to do up both these screws nice and tight and lock the pump into its final position. I'm now going to refit the expansion pipe and pressure gauge. So slip it in underneath that pipe, then drop it down into the pump housing like that. Give it a good old push and make sure it fits right down inside. When it's in the correct position, the expansion pipe should line up with the bottom of the expansion vessel, like that. I then use my long nose pliers to hold the clip so I can insert it into the pump housing, which will then lock the pressure gauge into its position. This can be a little bit fiddly. Once I've got the clip in, I'll then give the pipe a good old tug to make sure that it is definitely locked in position correctly. I can then take the small fibre washer, put it on top of the expansion pipe, like that, make sure I don't lose it, then slide the nut up and do it up onto the expansion vessel, like that. Before I tighten everything up, I'm just going to lock off that screw on the bottom of the bracket there, so that's going to hold the pump nice and steady now. I can then get my spanner and do up the two nuts. So there we go, that's the expansion nut tightened up. When I tighten the nut up onto the expansion vessel, I'd be very careful that the pipe doesn't twist and strain the fittings. So I always hold the pipe and make sure that it doesn't twist. I can then do the nut on the return pipe, remembering not to do this too tight, just need to nip that up. And there we go. Now all that's left is the pressure relief valve. Again, this can be a bit fiddly just to get it in the correct position. And once again, I use my long nose pliers to hold the retaining clip and push it down into its correct position, which can be a little tricky. Again, I give that a tug to make sure it's definitely locked in position. I can now plug the new pump into the circuit board. This only fits in one way round, so I can't get it wrong. And there we go, that's all done now. Now my last job is to fit this washer and do up the nut onto the bottom of the expansion relief valve. Again, this can be pretty fiddly and I couldn't get my camera in any position to film this. I always make sure that the rubber seal that goes around the threads on the expansion relief valve is pushed right up and out of the way. Otherwise it really hinders getting the nut on. Once I got the nut on, I can then do the nut up finger tight. Then once again I use my long nose pliers just to tighten that nut up. And there we go, we're good to go. Whilst I got the boiler all drained down, it's a good idea to check the pressure in the expansion vessel. The pressure was a little low, so I did recharge it, so now it's at 1 bar. But if you want to know more about expansion vessels, obviously I've made a video all about doing that and you can find that in the links below. Give the boiler a final vac out. Now I've turned the boiler back on, I've got F22 in the display as I would expect. So the pressure sensor is working fine on this boiler. I'm now going to open the filling loop and add a little bit of pressure to the system. Depending on your boiler depends on what filling loop you have. Now the pressure's not going up because I need to open the flow and return valves. I'm now going to open the return valve on the boiler. I'm not going to open the flow valve yet because I want to try and get all the air out of the boiler before it gets circulated around the system. I'm just going to check that the automatic air vent valve is open, which it is. So that's going to let the air out which is in the boiler. I'm now just going to turn the hot water tap on and off a couple of times, reset the boiler a couple of times. That's going to keep the pump running and just circulate the water around the boiler and remove as much air from the boiler as possible. And keep topping it up until I've got about 1.5 bar of pressure in the boiler. Once I'm happy that I've got as much air out of the boiler as possible, I'm then going to open the flow valve on the central heating. I'm now going to run the central heating to circulate the last of the air out of the boiler. Once I'm happy everything is running fine, I'm going to close that auto air vent down again because they do have a habit of leaking. One last check for leaks, but everything is looking good. Now I'm just going to write on a boiler case that the pressure vessel has been recharged and the pump has been replaced. This is really useful for me in the future. Now all that's left to do is to refit the boiler cover. And there we go, the job's all done. And finally, if you don't want to spend that £280 on that new Vaillant pump, then you might want to consider this BritTherm pump here. Now I fitted one of these the other day. This is what we call a pump head. It went in a treat and it worked absolutely fine. Just a note, if you got one of the newer Vaillant boilers which has 2 wires that come out of the pump, then you wouldn't be able to use this style of pump. Now I did do some measuring and checking just to make sure that the pump was going to fit into the old pump housing. The only real difference is the central impeller is just a little bit smaller than the original Grundfos pump. So I just removed the old wiring harness from the old pump and then fitted it onto the new BritTherm pump. And then just refit the cover and it's ready to go. Obviously, before we fit the new pump, we need to remove the old pump. And that's just a case of undoing the 4 screws on the outside of the pump. Now these can be quite tight, as you can see, but once they're undone, the pump head should just lift off without anything else needing to be undone or removed. Now I haven't taken out all the screws. Don't forget, when you wiggle the pump, you're going to get a whole lot of water come running out of your boiler. So once again, use my water vacuum, catching all that water that's coming out from the pump and the rest of the boiler. Once the water has stopped coming out of the pump housing, I can just lift away the pump like that. So the boiler I'm actually looking at right now is a Glowworm boiler, but Glowworm is part of the Vaillant group, so a lot of the parts are the same. But I had an old Vaillant pump in my van and I deliberately kept it because I wanted to compare it with these BritTherm pump heads. And once again, it's pretty much the same. Now once again, there's a slight difference between the inner size of the impeller. You can see there it's the same fit there, and on this BritTherm one it's slightly smaller. But once the pump was fitted, it didn't seem to make any difference. Maybe you lose a little bit of efficiency, but then maybe it makes no difference at all. And you can see how this BritTherm pump head fits nicely onto the Vaillant pump housing. And if you look at these two pump housings, you can see they are exactly the same. Now as usual, I get a little bit of silicone grease and just wipe it around the O-ring on the new pump. There we go, just smear that around there. Then it's just a case of fitting it to the pump housing. So I just place the new BritTherm pump into the housing and just do up the 4 screws. I do them up gently, doing it alternate to the sides, and I don't do them all up tight, just do them gently up and then gradually nipping each one up. So we get a nice even pull down of the pump onto the pump assembly. I did just check to make sure that the shaft span okay with the pump fitted onto the housing, and of course it span absolutely fine. Now the system's all full up and the pump is running and the boiler is heating up the central heating. Just write down when I replace the pump on the boiler, and there we go, that's that job done. So if you want to save yourself a few pounds, then maybe the BritTherm pump is the answer for you. Let me know in the comments if you do use one of these BritTherm pumps, or maybe a different pump head, and how you get on and whether it did the job for you. It'd be great for everyone to see your feedback. I will be making a more detailed video all about this BritTherm pump as I use it in more boilers. So keep a watch out for when that comes out. Right, that's about it then. So if you want to watch one of my other videos, you can click on the links just here. You can click on subscribe, click on the bell, give me a thumbs up, share me with your friends, and it's always my toolbox friend. Bye for now. See you next time.